My dad lifted his glass and said, "Some kids make you proud, others just take up space." Everyone laughed. I smiled and said, "Good thing I just got my own place 3,000 miles away. Don't worry. You'll never." I photographed 6 pages before I heard her stir again. Bank statements first, then a document with a raised notary seal, then a page with my father's signature at the bottom in the same looping hand he used to sign my report cards, back when signing my report cards was the only parenting he ever did that required a pen. My phone's camera shutter sound was still on. I'd forgotten to silence it, and every soft click felt in that quiet living room full of lavender and old paperbacks like it was echoing off every wall. I kept glancing toward the hallway, toward the closed door where she was napping, my pulse doing something uneven and fast in my throat. I wasn't a person who did things like this. I was a person who filled out expense reports on time and double-checked load calculations 3 separate ways before signing off on a design. Standing over an old woman's desk photographing her private financial documents felt like wearing a stranger's coat. I slid the folder back exactly where I'd found it, corner aligned with the edge of the desk blotter, the way you put back something you were never supposed to touch. My hands were still shaking when Grandma Eleanor shuffled back into the living room in her cardigan, rubbing sleep out of her eyes, asking if I wanted more tea. "I should head to the airport," I told her, which wasn't true yet, but felt truer with every second I stood in that room. I hugged her longer than usual at the door. She smelled like lavender and the inside of an old paperback, and I thought, with a kind of cold clarity that scared me a little, that I might be the only person left who was actually paying attention to her. I didn't say anything to her that night, but I already knew what I'd be doing next. I'd been a structural engineer for 6 years by then, the kind of job where a decimal point in the wrong place can put a bridge in a river. I worked at a mid-sized firm in South Lake Union, mostly on seismic retrofits for older buildings. The unglamorous kind of engineering nobody notices unless it fails. I built my whole career on the specific, unglamorous discipline of not trusting a number until I'd verified it 3 separate ways. It's a habit that doesn't turn off just because you've left the office. My coworkers joked that I double-checked restaurant bills the way other people checked their horoscopes. They weren't wrong. Growing up in a house where the truth kept shifting depending on who needed to look good that week had taught me, long before any engineering program did, that numbers were the one thing in my life that didn't lie to protect somebody's feelings. A load calculation didn't care whose favorite you were. A bank statement didn't clap you on the back or forget your name. That was, I think, part of why the basement had always felt safer than the upstairs. Machines told the truth. People in my family rarely did. Sitting in seat 14C on the flight back to Seattle, staring at 6 blurry phone photos of my grandmother's finances, I did the only thing I knew how to do with information that frightened me. I organized it. By the time we landed, I had a spreadsheet. 14 years of habit doesn't care that the numbers belong to someone you love. The first line item that stopped me cold was a home equity line of credit opened against Grandma's house 3 years earlier. $180,000, disbursed in 2 large transfers to an account under the name Kessler Family Holdings LLC. I sat with that for a long time in the Seattle rental car line, engine idling, other passengers shuffling past with their bags. Grandma's house had been paid off since before I was born. My grandfather had made sure of that before he died, a fact she'd mentioned to me at least a dozen times over the years, with the particular pride of a woman who'd lived through enough to know what it meant to own something outright. I told myself it was probably nothing sinister. Home repairs? A new roof? Medical bills nobody had bothered to tell me about because I lived 3,000 miles away and had, up until 11 days earlier, made myself very easy to leave out of things. That story lasted about 6 hours, right up until I found the registration filing for Kessler Family Holdings LLC, formed 4 months before the HELOC was opened. Sole listed officer, Richard Kessler, my father. I stared at the state business registry page on my laptop for a long time, the cursor blinking in the search bar, my apartment dark except for the glow of the screen. Kessler Family Holdings had no employer identification history, no filed annual reports beyond the bare minimum required to keep the entity active, no website, no phone number that connected to anything but a voicemail box that had never been set up. It existed, as far as I could tell, for exactly one purpose, and that purpose had a mailing address that matched my parents' house. I thought about all the years I'd assumed my father's steady, comfortable lifestyle came from the modest but respectable insurance brokerage he'd run since before I was born. I thought about the new truck he'd bought 2 years earlier, the one he'd made a point of mentioning at every family gathering since. I thought about how easily a man could build a whole second income stream out of an old woman's trust, and nobody would ever think to ask, because nobody in that family had ever been taught to ask my father anything. I called the bank the next morning, technically as an authorized secondary contact on Grandma's account, a designation she'd added years ago during a hospital stay and apparently never removed. The representative, a patient woman named Carla, who clearly had no idea what she was about to hand me, walked me through 18 months of statements while I sat at my kitchen island in Seattle with a legal pad and a coffee going cold beside me. "Is there anything specific you're looking for?" Carla asked at one point, her voice bright and unbothered, the voice of someone reading from a script that assumed every call like this one was routine. "I'm not sure yet," I told her, which was the most honest thing I'd said to anyone all week. The pattern, once I could actually see it laid out in black and white, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Withdrawals timed just under the threshold that would have triggered extra scrutiny from the bank's fraud department. A recurring $2,400 care management fee paid monthly to Kessler Family Holdings for a woman who lived alone, drove herself to church every Sunday, and had never once mentioned hiring anyone to manage anything. And 11 months earlier, a $46,000 transfer, memo line blank, landing 3 days before my brother Mason closed on a new house in a neighborhood so far above his actual income that I'd assumed at the time he'd finally gotten smart with a mortgage broker. He hadn't gotten smart. He'd gotten a down payment, quietly siphoned out of an 81-year-old woman's home equity by a man who'd stood at a Thanksgiving table 11 days earlier and told a room full of relatives that I was the child who took up space. My hands actually stopped working for a second, the way they do in real cold. I set the legal pad down and just breathed for a minute, staring at the fog rolling low over the water outside my window, feeling something in my chest reorganize itself completely. I called Grandma that evening, careful, testing the ground the way you test ice you're not sure will hold you. "Grandma, do you remember signing anything with Dad a few years back? Something about the house?" There was a pause I didn't like. "Your father handles those things, dear. He said the bank needed some updated paperwork. I don't understand all that anymore. I just sign where he tells me to sign. Do you remember what the paperwork was for?" "Nora, honey, why are you asking me about this?" Her voice had gone thin, the particular thinness of someone who's spent a lifetime being told not to worry about things and has finally, gratefully, stopped trying to. "Your father takes care of it. He's very good with money. Always has been." "Has he ever explained the payments, Grandma? The monthly ones?" "What payments?" She genuinely didn't know. I could hear it in the small silence that followed, the confusion of a woman being asked about withdrawals from her own account like they were a foreign language. That silence told me more than any bank statement had. Whatever my father had built, he'd built it in a place she couldn't see, using a trust she'd never once thought to question, because questioning her own son had simply never occurred to her as something a mother was allowed to do. I didn't push further that night. I told myself it was because I didn't want to frighten her. Some of it was that. Some of it, if I'm honest, was that I still wasn't sure I was ready to be right. I called back 3 days later, gentler this time, and asked if I could take her to lunch the next time I was in town, just the two of us, no particular occasion. She said that sounded lovely. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that her doctor had asked her to come back for some memory tests, the kind of detail she delivered so lightly I almost missed how much weight it was actually carrying. I hung up the phone and sat very still in my kitchen for a long time. Patricia Yoon had practiced elder law for 22 years, the last 9 of them almost exclusively on financial exploitation cases, and she listened to my entire spreadsheet-fueled explanation without interrupting once, which I would later learn was rarer in that line of work than it should be. I'd found her through a state bar referral line at 1 a.m., unable to sleep, scrolling through attorney profiles like they were the only thing standing between my grandmother and total ruin. Her office called back within an hour of my morning email, which told me something about how seriously they took a stranger's panicked message before they'd even seen the evidence. "I want to be direct with you," she said once I'd finished, her voice calm in a way that made my own racing pulse slow down slightly just from proximity to it. "What you're describing has a name. It's called financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. And if there's a cognitive impairment involved, timed anywhere near when these documents were signed, that changes everything about how quickly we can move and how seriously the state will take it." She mentioned memory tests, I said, just this week. Patricia was quiet for a second. "Do you know who her doctor is?" I did. I'd had it memorized since childhood, the way you memorize the small, stable facts of people you love. Dr. Amara Osi, Eleanor's primary care physician for 11 years, a woman I'd met exactly twice and trusted instinctively both times. Patricia recommended I file a report with the county's Adult Protective Services unit before doing anything else, before confronting my father, before even telling my mother. "The moment you tip him off," she said, "documents start disappearing. Or worse, he starts trying to get her to sign something that retroactively makes all of this look authorized. You need a paper trail that predates his knowledge that you're looking." I filed the report the next morning. "You need a paper trail that predates his knowledge that you're looking." I filed the report the next morning. The caseworker assigned to Grandma's case was a soft-spoken, exhausted-sounding man named Marcus Webb, who told me, in the flat, practiced tone of someone who has seen this particular story unfold 100 times, with 100 different family names attached to it, that financial exploitation cases involving adult children were, statistically, the overwhelming majority of what crossed his desk. "It's almost never a stranger," he said. "It's almost always someone with a key to the house." He scheduled a welfare visit with Grandma for the following week, careful, he said, to frame it as a routine check-in, rather than anything alarming, so as not to spook whoever might be watching for exactly that kind of reaction. He asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself yet. How often my father visited her, whether she'd ever mentioned feeling pressured to sign anything quickly, whether anyone had ever discouraged her from having other family members present during financial conversations. Each question landed like a small, precise tap against a wall I hadn't realized was already cracking. "Based on what you've sent me," Marcus said near the end of the call, "I'm going to be honest with you. This looks serious. I've seen worse, but not by much." My mother called 2 nights later, before I'd told anyone in the family what I'd started. I never found out how she'd sensed something was moving, only that mothers who've spent 30 years reading A Room for Danger develop an instinct for it even when nobody's told them anything directly. "Whatever you're doing," she said, her voice careful, coaxing, the same tone she'd used my whole childhood to talk my father down off a bad mood before it could land on someone. "Please think about what it does to this family. Your grandmother is happy. She doesn't need this stress at her age." "She's not happy, Mom. She has $1,100 in her checking account." The silence on the line told me she hadn't known that number either. It told me something else too, that some part of her had already suspected enough to be afraid of finding out for certain. "Please, Nora, can't you just let your father explain it to you, privately, before it goes any further?" "He's had 32 years to explain things to me privately," I said. "I'm done waiting in rooms for him to decide I'm worth an explanation." She didn't call again for 3 weeks. Dr. Ocy's records, once Patricia obtained them through a formal request with Grandma's consent, told a story that made my stomach turn in an entirely new direction. Eleanor had been flagged for mild cognitive concerns during a routine visit 4 years earlier. Nothing severe, nothing that would have stripped her of her legal capacity, but enough that Dr. Ocy had recommended in writing that any major financial or legal decisions be reviewed by a third party going forward. The durable power of attorney naming my father as sole agent had been signed 5 months after that note went into her chart. I read that timeline 3 times before it fully landed. 5 months. Enough time for the note to be filed, forgotten by everyone except a doctor's record system, and quietly stepped around by a son who either hadn't bothered to ask about it or had asked and simply decided it didn't apply to him. Theo Nakamura, the forensic accountant Patricia brought in to formally trace the money, spent 3 weeks pulling threads I hadn't even known existed. He worked the way I imagined a surgeon might. Unhurried, methodical, treating every transaction like tissue that needed to be handled carefully so as not to damage what was underneath it. He requested 8 years of records instead of the 3 I'd already flagged, explaining that exploitation rarely started where the victim's family first noticed it. He was right. The pattern, once fully mapped, stretched back further than any of us had guessed. In total, Theo told me on a call in early February, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who deals in numbers precisely because numbers don't ask you to feel anything. "We're looking at just under $210,000 moved out of your grandmother's accounts in equity over 3 years, with no documented benefit returning to her. Her checking account balance right now is $1,140. He paused, and for the first time in 3 weeks of clinical, unbothered updates, something almost gentle crept into his voice. "I've done this a long time, Nora. This one's bad. I want you to know that going in, so the number doesn't surprise you worse in a courtroom than it does right now on the phone with me. An 81-year-old woman who'd owned her house outright, who'd raised 2 children and buried a husband and never once asked anyone for anything, had $1,100 to her name because her son had a system, and the system had a paper trail. And the paper trail had my name on it now too, because I was the one who'd finally decided to read it. My father found out someone was asking questions on a Tuesday in late February, though I never learned exactly how. Marcus Webb suspected a teller at the bank branch Dad frequented, someone who'd mentioned an unusual account inquiry in passing to the wrong person at the wrong dinner. Whatever the source, my mother called me that night, her voice pitched low like she was hiding in a closet to make the call. "Your father's been on the phone all evening," she whispered, with a real estate agent, about Mom's house, my grandmother's house. Paid off, then quietly remortgaged, and now apparently about to be sold out from under her entirely. Fast, before anyone could stop it. "He's saying she can't manage it alone anymore," my mother said. "He's saying it's for her own good, that she should be somewhere with support. Nora, I don't know what's true anymore. I don't know what he's doing." I could hear the television going in the background on her end. Low volume, the specific white noise of a house pretending everything inside it was normal. 32 years of that same low hum, I thought. 32 years of a woman turning the volume up just enough to drown out whatever she didn't want to examine too closely. "I do," I said, "and we have about 2 days to stop it." I called Patricia at 11 p.m. She didn't sound surprised, which somehow made it worse. "This is a common move once someone realizes they're being investigated," she said. "Liquidate the asset fast, distance himself from a paper trail he can't erase, and if the house sells, tracing those proceeds gets exponentially harder. We need an emergency petition, temporary guardianship, or at minimum an emergency restraining order on the sale, filed before that listing goes live. How fast can you file it? Tomorrow morning, but Nora, a judge needs to see urgency and clean hands. You need need to be in Indianapolis when this happens, not on a phone from Seattle. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment, the refrigerator humming, the city dark and quiet outside the window, and felt the particular vertigo of a decision that had already been made before I'd finished consciously making it. I booked the 6 a.m. flight, standing in my kitchen in my socks, running purely on the kind of adrenaline that doesn't leave room for fear, until much later. I packed a single bag. I didn't sleep. I sat on my couch with my laptop open, refreshing Theo's report one more time, memorizing numbers I already knew by heart, the way you check a locked door twice even after you've already checked it once. I landed at 1:40 p.m. Indianapolis time and went straight from the airport to Patricia's local co-counsel's office, a sharp, no-nonsense elder law litigator named Faith Ibarra who'd handled the local filing, while Patricia coordinated from her own office 2 states away. The emergency petition for temporary guardianship, supported by Theo's forensic report and Dr. Osei's chart notes, went in front of a probate judge at 3 p.m. that same afternoon. I sat in a hard plastic chair outside courtroom 4 for 40 minutes that felt like 4 hours, running through every version of what could go wrong. My father could deny everything. He could produce some explanation I hadn't accounted for. He'd had 32 years of practice making the truth sound smaller than it was, and I'd only had 11 weeks to learn how to fight back. A court officer walked past twice. A woman 2 chairs down cried quietly into a tissue over what I assumed was an entirely different family's entirely different catastrophe, and I remember thinking, distantly, that this hallway must absorb more grief in a single afternoon than most buildings see in a year. I checked my phone 11 times in 40 minutes. No new messages, no word from my father, which felt somehow worse than if he'd been calling non-stop. Faith came out at 3:52 p.m., with an expression I couldn't read at all. "Emergency temporary guardianship granted," she said, effective immediately. The court also issued a restraining order blocking any sale, transfer, or further financial activity on your grandmother's assets until a full hearing in 30 days. Nora, the judge specifically noted the pattern documented in the accountant's report was, in her words, deeply troubling. I sat down hard on the plastic chair, my legs suddenly unreliable underneath me. "There's one more thing," Faith said more gently. "The court is required to notify your father of the guardianship filing today. He knows by now. He called 4 times in the next hour. I let all 4 go to voicemail." "The 5th call," I answered, standing in the hallway outside the courtroom with Faith's business card still in my hand. "What did you do?" Not a question. A verdict. Delivered the way he delivered everything, like the world owed him an explanation rather than the other way around. "I read a folder on Grandma's desk," I said. "You should be more careful about where you leave things. You have no idea what you've done. That house, that money, I have been taking care of this family for. You took $210,000 out of an 81-year-old woman's life," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "You did it after her doctor put a note in her chart telling you not to make major decisions for her without oversight. You did it to buy Mason a house and lease yourself a car and pay yourself a consulting fee for consulting nobody. And then 11 days after the last withdrawal cleared, you stood up at a dinner table and called me the child who takes up space." Silence on the line, the specific silence of a man discovering for the first time in his life that the room was no longer arranging itself around him. "You'll destroy this family over money," he finally said, quieter now, almost pleading, a register I'd never once heard from him in 32 years. "Is that really who you want?" Most pleading, a register I'd never once heard from him in 32 years. "Is that really who you want to be?" "I'm not the one who destroyed this family, Dad. I just turned on the lights. I'm not doing this to hurt you," I added, which was almost true. "I'm doing it because somebody in this family finally had to actually look." I hung up before he could answer. It felt less like slamming a door and more like finally, calmly, locking one that had been swinging open my whole life. The 30-day hearing in March lasted most of a full day. Dr. Osei testified about the chart note and the timeline, calm and precise, the kind of witness who makes a courtroom go very quiet without raising her voice at all. Theo walked the judge through the spreadsheet, line by line, in the same careful, unbothered voice he'd used with me on the phone in February, projecting each transaction onto a screen while my father's attorney scribbled notes he'd eventually have almost nothing to do with. My father's attorney tried to argue the withdrawals were legitimate family loans, a defense that collapsed within minutes once Faith produced the absence of a single promissory note, repayment schedule, or piece of correspondence supporting that claim anywhere in 3 years of records. I testified too for 11 minutes, describing the folder on the desk, the photographs, the phone call with Grandma where she genuinely hadn't known what payments I was even asking about. I kept my eyes on Patricia during most of it, the way she'd told me to, and my voice only shook once, on the sentence where I described my grandmother's checking account balance out loud in a room full of strangers. My father sat at the defense table the entire day without once looking in my direction. I watched the back of his neck instead, the same stiff, unreachable posture he'd worn at every dinner table of my childhood, and under understood, watching it now from a witness stand instead of a kid's table, that I was finally the one deciding what happened next. The court converted the temporary guardianship into a permanent one, transferred to a neutral professional fiduciary rather than to me, at Patricia's recommendation, so that nothing about Grandma's care would ever again depend on which family member happened to be paying attention. The judge referred the case separately to the county prosecutor's elder abuse unit. My father was charged 4 months later with financial exploitation of an endangered adult, a felony in our state once the dollar amount crossed a certain threshold, which $210,000 cleared by a wide margin. He took a plea deal that fall rather than risk a trial. Restitution in full, 5 years of probation, and a permanent bar from ever again serving as a fiduciary or power of attorney for any vulnerable adult in the state. He kept his insurance license by the narrowest possible margin, a fact that still made my jaw tighten every time I thought about it, though Faith reminded me more than once that restitution and a felony record were consequences most families in our position never actually got to see land. Mason, who it turned out had known exactly where his down payment came from, avoided criminal charges himself but was named in the civil restitution order alongside our father, which meant the house he'd been so proud to show off at another Thanksgiving 2 years earlier eventually had a lien on it that took him the better part of 3 years to pay off. He sent me one email that October, short, defensive, insisting he'd assumed the money was a legitimate gift and hadn't asked questions because that's not how our family works. He wasn't wrong about that last part. He just hadn't understood, until the lien attached to his own front door, exactly how much that particular family tradition had always cost someone else. My mother didn't testify against my father, but she also didn't stand beside him in that courtroom, not once. And something about her sitting alone in the back row, 3 seats away from Mason, told me more about where 3 decades of silence had actually gotten her than any conversation between us ever could. We talk now occasionally, careful conversations that never quite reach the years we lost, but conversations nonetheless. It's more than I expected. It's less than I once wanted. I've learned to let both of those things be true at the same time. Grandma moved into a small, sun-filled, independent living apartment that spring, chosen by her fiduciary with input from a woman who, for the first time in years, actually got to have input in her own life. I flew out for the move, unpacked boxes of photographs that finally, for once, included pictures of me, and hung them on her new walls myself, careful to leave room for more. I should have looked closer, she told me one evening, sitting across from her new small dining table, the kind with exactly enough chairs for the people who actually deserved a seat. Late spring light came through the window behind her, warm and gold, catching the silver in her hair the same way it had in that diner booth back in November. All those years, I should have asked more questions. You trusted your son, I said. That's not a crime, Grandma. It's just love with bad information. She reached across the table and took my hand, the way she had in that diner booth back in November, before any of this had a name yet. You gave me my questions back, she said. That's not nothing, Nora. We sat there for a long time after that, not saying much, just letting the evening settle around us the way it does when nobody in the room needs anything from you except your company. Before I left, she pressed an old photograph into my hand, one I'd never seen before, of her and my grandfather standing in front of the very house that had, for a few years, quietly stopped belonging to her without her knowledge. For your own wall, she said. You should have one too. I fly out to see her every few months now. No occasion required, no toast to survive, no assigned seat waiting to remind me of my place. We eat at diners with chipped mugs. She tells me about the book club she joined at the new building, the friend she's made 2 doors down who used to be a pediatric nurse, the small, ordinary joys of a life that finally, belatedly, belongs entirely to her. I flew home to Seattle a few days later, and for the first time since that Thanksgiving toast, the flight didn't feel like running from anything. It felt like exactly what it was. A woman going home to a table she'd built herself, with room at it for everyone who'd actually earned a seat.